Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn son, a significant figure in the Bible. At that time, God had promised Abraham that he would have a son and become the father of many nations. However, as time passed, Sarah, Abraham's wife, was still unable to conceive. Both of them began to worry about how God would fulfill this promise. In Genesis chapter 16, Sarah decided to come up with a solution that she thought might help. She suggested that Abraham have a child with Hagar, her Egyptian slave. This was a common practice at the time. When a wife could not bear children, she would ask a servant or maid to have children in her place. In this case, Sarah thought that if Hagar bore Abraham's child, the child would be considered Sarah's. Although this seemed like a reasonable solution, it caused many problems. Hagar became pregnant and gave birth to Abraham's son. However, when Hagar realized she was pregnant, she began to feel proud and looked down on Sarah. This made Sarah feel insulted and angry. She sought a way to resolve the issue but didn't know what to do. Sarah complained to Abraham, saying that she had made a mistake by allowing Hagar to become pregnant, and now she felt despised. Abraham responded by saying that Sarah had the right to do whatever she wanted with Hagar, but this only made the situation more complicated. Sarah began to mistreat Hagar, and eventually, Hagar ran away. In a state of despair, Hagar happened to encounter an angel of the Lord by a well in the desert. The angel asked Hagar about her journey and why she was running away. Hagar replied that she was fleeing from Sarah. The angel told her to return and submit to Sarah, and promised that the child she was carrying would become a great nation. The angel also told her that the child would be named Ishmael, which means, God hears, or God has listened. This symbolized that God had heard Hagar's suffering. The angel also informed her that Ishmael would become a free and strong man, living on his own terms and always in conflict with those around him. Moved by the angel's words, Hagar named the place where she encountered the angel Bir Lahai Roi, which means, well of the living one, who sees me. She then returned to Sarah and Abraham. Abraham, at the age of 86, accepted this son and named him Ishmael. Although Ishmael was Abraham's son, his story didn't end there. He would become an important figure in history, not only because of his relationship with Abraham but also because of God's promises concerning his future and the nations that would arise from Ishmael's descendants. When Abraham was 99 years old, God appeared to him and said, "I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless," Genesis 17 verse 1. This was a pivotal moment in Abraham's life when God reaffirmed his promise about Abraham's descendants and made a covenant with him and his descendants. At this time, God also commanded that all the male members of Abraham's household be circumcised as a sign of this covenant. At this point, Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn son with Hagar, was cast out of the family after Isaac, Sarah's son, was born and raised. Although Ishmael was Abraham's son, the family situation became complicated when Isaac was born. Sarah, jealous of Hagar and Ishmael, requested that Abraham send them away. Abraham, though heartbroken, obeyed Sarah's request and allowed Hagar and Ishmael to leave. Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the desert, near Bir Shabbat, close to dying from thirst. However, when all hope seemed lost, God answered Hagar's prayer, providing them with water and life. Ishmael and his mother continued their life in the wilderness, where he grew up and learned how to use a bow. Ishmael married an Egyptian woman, which explains his close ties to Egypt and the influence of his mother. Ishmael lived in the desert of Paran and became a wild nomad, not adhering to the rules of more settled families. However, this did not mean that Ishmael was completely disconnected from Abraham's family. When Abraham passed away, Ishmael joined Isaac in burying their father in the cave of Machpelah, an event that showed the connection between the two, despite the differences in their lives. Later, Ishmael's daughter, Mahalath, was married to Esau, Isaac's son, which further proves that the relationships within Abraham's family were not completely severed, despite the significant differences in the way the tribes lived and their goals. Ishmael's life is depicted in the Bible with very distinct characteristics. God described Ishmael as being like a wild donkey, meaning he was a nomad, not bound to any fixed land and living a free life, independent of anyone. This freedom also meant that he always faced conflicts and challenges, but he was also protected by God, who promised to make a great nation from his descendants. However, Ishmael did not experience the covenant of God in the same way as Isaac's descendants, though he was still promised that he would become a great nation, with a social structure consisting of 12 tribes, similar to the nation of Israel. When God made a covenant with Abraham, he changed his name from Abram to Abraham, meaning, father of many nations. God promised to make Abraham into a great nation, and kings would come from his descendants. This covenant included not only blessings but also land, where Abraham and his descendants would live. A key part of this covenant was the command that all male children in Abraham's household be circumcised as a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham's descendants. God also changed Sarah's name from Sarai to Sarah, and promised that she would bear Abraham a son, despite her old age. This son would be Isaac, and through Isaac, God would continue his covenant with Abraham's family. Although Ishmael's life faced many challenges, according to God's promise, Ishmael's descendants would also become a great nation with significant influence in the history of humanity. When Abraham heard God's promise that Sarah would bear him a son, despite her old age, he could not help but be amazed. Abraham fell on his face and laughed, wondering to himself, "Will a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And will Sarah, my wife, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" Genesis 17 verse 17. Despite this, Abraham prayed to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." However, God answered that Sarah would bear Abraham a son and name him Isaac. God confirmed that his covenant would be established with Isaac and would continue through his descendants, an everlasting covenant. God also answered Abraham's prayer about Ishmael. He promised that Ishmael would become a great nation, with 12 princes, and would become a mighty nation. However, God's covenant would not be established with Ishmael, but with Isaac, the son that Sarah would bear in the coming year. After hearing God's words, Abraham immediately obeyed God's command. He had all the males in his household, including Ishmael, circumcised, as well as those born in his house or purchased with money from foreigners. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised on the same day, Genesis 17 verses 23 to 27. Although Ishmael was circumcised according to God's command, this did not mean that he was considered the heir to the covenant. The covenant was established with Isaac, the son that Sarah would bear. This distinction is clearly evident in the Bible, where it is stated that circumcision was not the only sign of the covenant, but rather a deeper event connected to the relationship between God and Abraham's descendants through Isaac. Even though God affirmed the covenant with Isaac, Abraham treated Ishmael with kindness and was heartbroken when Sarah asked him to send Ishmael away. Sarah feared that Ishmael would threaten Isaac's position in the family, and she requested that Abraham remove Hagar and Ishmael. Feeling sad and conflicted, Abraham prayed to God for help. God told Abraham not to be distressed by Sarah's decision. God instructed Abraham to listen to Sarah because Isaac would be the one through whom Abraham's descendants would continue. However, God also promised that he would make a nation from Ishmael because Ishmael was Abraham's son. When Sarah gave birth to Isaac, she laughed joyfully and said that everyone would laugh with her. It was a great miracle that Sarah, who was old and frail, could bear a child. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old, fulfilling God's promise. When Isaac was born, Abraham circumcised him on the 8th day, as God had commanded. Isaac grew up and was weaned. Abraham held a great feast when Isaac was weaned. However, during this time, Sarah saw Hagar's son, Ishmael, mocking Isaac. This caused Sarah to be intolerant, and she asked Abraham to expel Hagar and Ishmael from the family. Abraham was deeply saddened about Ishmael, but God comforted him, assuring him that he would protect Ishmael and make him a great nation, even though God's official covenant would be carried out through Isaac. The story of Ishmael and Isaac in the Bible is not only about Abraham's two sons but also reflects the complex relationship between the descendants and God's covenant. While Ishmael was not chosen to inherit the covenant, God still blessed him and made him the father of a great nation. When Hagar and Ishmael were cast out of Abraham's family, they wandered in the desert of Beersheba. Hagar had little food and water, but when the water in the skin ran out, she feared for her son's life. In desperation, she placed Ishmael under a shrub and sat at a distance, thinking she would not have to watch him die. Hagar wept, but God heard Ishmael's cries, and an angel of God called to Hagar from heaven, telling her not to be afraid because God had heard the boy's voice. The angel told Hagar to get up, take the boy by the hand, and go, for God would make him a great nation. When Hagar stood up, her eyes were opened, and she saw a well of water. She filled the skin with water and gave Ishmael a drink. God was with the boy and protected him, helping him grow and become a skilled hunter, living in the wilderness of Paran. Hagar found a wife for Ishmael from Egypt, her homeland, and Ishmael continued to live an independent life, far from Abraham's family. The story then moves to another event in Abraham's life. King Abimelech and his army commander, Phicol, came to Abraham and asked him to swear not to harm them or their descendants because they knew that God was with Abraham in all that he did. Abraham agreed and swore that he would not harm them. However, when Abraham brought up the issue of a well that Abimelech's servants had seized, King Abimelech denied knowing who had done it. To settle the dispute, Abraham gave Abimelech some sheep and cattle, and the two made a covenant at that place, using the well as a witness. To clarify that the well was his, Abraham set aside 7 new lambs and said that they would serve as a testimony that he had dug the well. He named the place Beersheba because this was where the two had sworn an oath. Afterward, Abimelech and Phicol returned to the land of the Philistines, while Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God, showing his reverence and worship for God. The story of sending Hagar and Ishmael away is a controversial situation and does not follow the normal customs of the time. According to ancient law, children of slaves could not be cast out without a valid reason. This shows the severity of the decision, but it was made according to God's command. Although Abraham found it difficult to make this decision, he obeyed God, demonstrating his trust in God's plan rather than the social norms of the time. A question arises: did Ishmael truly pose a threat to Isaac, or was it simply the existence of Ishmael that Sarah perceived as a threat to Isaac's inheritance? This story reflects the contrast between two lineages: Isaac, the son of Sarah and Abraham, chosen by God to inherit the covenant, and Ishmael, the son of Hagar, who, though not chosen, was still blessed by God and became the father of a great nation. From a theological perspective, the story of Ishmael and Isaac is told not only to portray two individuals but to illustrate God's work in fulfilling his promises. It shows that when God fulfills his promises to Abraham, he is not bound by natural or worldly standards, but by his divine selection and plan. The expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael from Abraham's family creates a stark contrast in the Bible, highlighting the difference between Isaac's lineage, the heir to the covenant, and Ishmael's lineage. In the book of Genesis, we see that Ishmael, although not the heir to God's covenant, nonetheless has a strong progeny. Ishmael's descendants are clearly recorded in two passages, Genesis 25 verses 12 to 16 and 1 Chronicles 1 verses 29 to 31. According to Genesis 25 verses 12 to 16, the sons of Ishmael included 12 princes, just like Jacob and Esau, who each had 12 sons. This list includes names like Nibahath, Kedar, Adbel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadar, Tema, Jatir, Naphish, and Kedema. The sons of Ishmael settled in areas near where they grew up, particularly in the wilderness of Paran, a region from Havilah to Shur, opposite Egypt and near Assyria. What is remarkable is that although Ishmael was not chosen to inherit God's covenant, his descendants became a great nation, with a structure consisting of 12 tribes, similar to Israel. These tribes later became an important part of history and are sometimes recorded in Assyrian chronicles. However, the descendants of Ishmael, and Ishmael himself, were sometimes seen as enemies of Israel. For example, in 1 Chronicles 5 verse 19, the Ishmaelites waged war against other tribes in the region. In Genesis 16 verse 12, God describes Ishmael as a wild man, with his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. This reflects a continual conflict between Ishmael's descendants and other peoples, particularly Israel. Ishmael's descendants are also mentioned in other parts of the Bible, such as Genesis 37 verses 25 to 28 and 37:36, when Joseph's brothers sold him to a caravan of traders. These traders are referred to as Ishmaelites, though in some instances, the term may refer to tribes related to Ishmael, such as the Midianites, descendants of Keturah, Abraham's wife after Sarah. This shows the overlap between the tribes of Ishmael and other groups in the stories of Joseph and subsequent events. In the book of Galatians, Galatians 4 verse 29, Paul also refers to Ishmael, though he does not name him specifically. It is clear that Paul draws inspiration from the story in Genesis. Paul uses the imagery of Ishmael and Isaac to illustrate the difference between living according to the flesh and living according to the Spirit. Paul writes, "But as he who was born according to the flesh then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, even so it is now," Galatians 4 verse 29. This statement clarifies that the division between Isaac and Ishmael is not just a family event, but also reflects the division between two ways of living and receiving God's promises. Although Ishmael was not the one chosen to inherit God's everlasting covenant, his life and descendants prove that God fulfilled his promise to Abraham, not only through Isaac but also through Ishmael. God blessed Ishmael and made him the father of a strong nation, even though Isaac's lineage was the one that inherited the covenant. This division has had a profound impact on historical events that followed.